Hey there, everyone. Thanks very much for stopping by the Digital Creator Daily. If you're new here, I'm Rob from Hey Summit, and this is the daily-ish show where I get to have some awesome conversations with brilliant people doing very interesting things. We talk about the creator mindset, staying authentic, assembling your toolkit, your creator toolkit, exploring platforms, and more. It's a pretty relaxed show about and for creators, thought leaders, independent entrepreneurs, and just a reminder, a conversation is best when it's shared. So however you're tuning in, feel free to jump in with your thoughts, with your questions and perspectives. And thanks again for spending some time with us. So today I am incredibly lucky to have on Steph Smith. Steph has been working remotely for over 5 years as a growth marketer, writer, and indie maker. She spent 3 years at TopTal and now leads trends.co at The Hustle, which was acquired by HubSpot. While at Trends, she scaled the product to millions in ARR and 15K plus paying subscribers. She's a self-taught developer that has built multiple projects, including some that have topped Product Hunt, leading to a nomination of Maker of the Year in 2018. She also has a personal blog that has been read by over 500,000 people, touching on topics including remote work, productivity, and tech. She also wrote a book, Doing Content Right, that sold nearly 2,000 copies in its first 2 months. Most recently, she's been working on the Shit You Don't Learn in School podcast. So all of those things I am incredibly curious to learn a bit more about. But without further ado, here's Steph. Thanks so much for coming on and spending some time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And that was such a nice, generous introduction.
All good. I have to say that so we've been doing this now for a few weeks, and one of my early guests that I had on was my brother, who is a podcaster. He's a podcaster in the VC world, a consumer VC. And I mentioned that you were coming on, and he got super excited because he's been learning from you personally over for a while now. In terms of reading your content and learning just how to kind of get into that mindset. So I certainly knew that you were impactful, but it was pretty cool to hear about how excited he was for you to be on.
Oh, that's awesome! Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, so I'd love to start off with first off, I guess we talk a lot about independent entrepreneurship. So the alternative to that a lot of people think is working for a company and never doing anything yourself. So I guess I'd love to start off with talking about Trends, because you'd describe that as like your day job. Would that be
definitely
fair to say?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So yeah,
I work for a company now, actually HubSpot, because they acquired The Hustle, but I worked at The Hustle for 2 years, and I lead the product Trends, as you mentioned, trends.co. If people are interested, and it's all about finding trends before they happen or as they're in their early stages. And yes, like you said, that's my full-time job. So even though I create a lot of things on the side for fun, that is like my financial freedom, I guess, to have a job and have that stable income, which we can get into later if you want. But I think that's actually like an underrated thing that I've intentionally designed, which I think a lot of people don't do. As you said, most people think either like I work full time or I quit my job and go all in, kind of like, high school dropout route. But there is somewhere in between that I really enjoy.
And so, I mean, so I'd love to talk about that now, but when it comes to thinking about your full-time job, the idea of what Trends is kind of perfect when it comes to thinking about looking whether it's celebrating the independent entrepreneur or celebrating the person who wants to take advantage of trends or of things that are happening and figure out a way to prosper from it, make an impact of it from it, or otherwise. How do you approach that? Do you think that that's quite congruent with your maybe identity as a creator, or was it just quite happenstance that you got involved?
Well, it's a little bit of both, right? So I didn't actually seek out Trends, and I can't take responsibility for creating it. Yeah, Sam. So like he's the one who created it, thought of the idea. So kudos to him for doing that. But yeah, he ended up finding my work online through one of my blog articles, and he reached out and he was just like, look, I'm creating this thing. And one of the things that Sam is amazing at is hiring people and then really giving them the reins. So he really did just like give me the reins to this thing. But to his credit, there are very few things at that point in time that I would have pursued in terms of jobs, because I was kind of like, should I go create something on my own? Or like I was getting at that point a decent amount, not as much as now, but like a decent amount of people reaching out. And so I was like really thinking about what I want my next, job to be at the time. Yeah. And that was one of the only things where I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Because as you said, it's really congruent with the fact that if I was not doing Trends on, as my full-time job, I would have been doing a lot of the things that I did for Trends anyway, right? So I would have been going down these rabbit holes for fun instead of now getting paid to do it. And one of my colleagues who actually used to work with me at TopTal, Ethan Brooks, he said the same thing, because I helped recruit him. And then a couple months in, I was checking in with him and I was like, hey, Ethan, like, how are things going? Are you enjoying the role, the company, et cetera? And he's like, I just can't believe we get paid to do this. And I know that's like a lot of people say that, but really like it is congruent in the ways that you said, because I naturally am so interested in creating my own products or, being involved in tech and business and entrepreneurship in particular. And so I would and was already researching a lot of this stuff and writing about it. And then now I just get paid to do it with the team that also equally enjoys it.
Well, also though, having seemingly, unknowingly how, but like seemingly enough bandwidth to still do a lot of this other stuff, which I think is maybe something that people assume is just not possible, not being able to do or something like that.
I think that's important there because, well, one, I will caveat, because whenever I say what I'm about to say, sometimes people will say, hey, you don't have kids, or there are certain things that like you have that I don't have. And that's true. I don't live the same life as many other people. I will say that I intentionally designed my life in a way to allow a lot of this stuff. But again, I don't have kids, and I don't claim to know what it's like to have kids either. But what is important is that, as we were mentioning before, a lot of people think like I either work full time and that's, zaps a lot of my energy and I don't have time for anything else, or I need to go like all in the other route and quit my job, build a company quickly, raise money potentially. And it's worth just noting that we tend to, as humans, think in really binary terms, like something's good or bad. But it's really helpful to start thinking in like less binary terms. And in this case, what I realized over time is that I was able to, especially with Trends and being a part of that team, find a job that didn't take over my whole life. I do work hard, but it didn't take over my whole life, that I truly enjoy. So it's not zapping me at the end of the day where I'm just like, oh, this is exhausting. And then having enough time to do things that I enjoy. And that's really important, because a lot of people say like, how do you work on so many things, so many different projects? And what's important there is every single project that I pursue, like outside of work, I want to pursue. And it's actually, enjoyable for me to do. So the same way other people enjoy their hobbies, I enjoy like creating stuff, tinkering with stuff online. But what's important there is that I think a lot of people, when they seek out work or like what they should do with their life, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but they seek to make their passion their livelihood. And there's nothing necessarily wrong there, but what you'll notice is often when you turn something into your livelihood, there's a lot more pressure around it. And again, it becomes this thing where it's like, oh God, am I going to get a paycheck at the end of the day? And I find it much more enjoyable to, in some way, separate the two so that I have my livelihood through Trends, through something, again, that I truly enjoy. And then that gives me the kind of mental clarity to just pursue whatever I want on the side just for fun, which means some days I wake up and I'm like, I don't really want to tinker with stuff online, and I don't, right? But then other days where I'm like, there's no pressure to do this, but I want to do this. I think that's really important. And I don't see that many creators that acknowledge that are like okay with their livelihood coming from one arena and then, just pursuing stuff for fun in another. But that I also think feeds into like your ability to be creative, your ability to show up in ways when, again, there's not this pressure versus other people who go all in. I think a lot of people who do that realize pretty soon, like, oh man, like, did I really want this? Like, am I turning something that I loved into something that, again, is now like filled with pressure and constraints?
Exactly. I mean, it's almost like I think you were saying it before, like turning your hobby or turning your passion into your full-time gig versus knowing that it is a passion, and therefore maybe experimenting with ways of making that sustainable, or making a little bit of extra income with it, but being pretty clear with yourself about the distinction between one or the other. I guess that the challenge is, I think a lot of people see a job as either a necessary evil, and therefore they are rushing to get away from that from a headspace perspective. And then they put into this idea that, oh, I really love making soap. I'm going to go off and become a soap maker. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to make lots of money from it. And I'm going to have fun with it. But that's maybe a reaction to how you're feeling about what your job is doing for you. Or they feel like, when you use the term full-time, and when I certainly talk to a lot of people and they're like, yeah, but I have a full-time job. That's full-time. There's no other time. Like, okay, well, let's just try and unpack that a bit.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's worth acknowledging that a lot of the things in our lives are really arbitrary. So, you can go down a long list of things. The 40-hour work week came from like the industrial era and people working in factories, right? Even like just research some of these things, like eating 3 meals a day, that came from a specific era and time where people started to do that because of certain constraints. The reason we work in offices, that again came from the past and the need to work from an office. And then if you acknowledge that most things in your life are arbitrary, so is this idea of like working full time, working 8 hours, pouring your whole life into a job. Like you can very easily, or maybe not very easily, I should say, but you can find a job that you like that doesn't zap all of your energy away, and that gives you flexibility to some degree, that especially now after COVID, with a lot more companies allowing that flexibility, so that you have energy to focus on elsewhere. And one important aspect is, I'm not saying that people shouldn't make their passion their livelihood, but also one thing that's important here is that I think it's important to do it on a timeline that makes it, again, like less pressurized. And another kind of like thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people, again, in this binary mindset of like, you're either working full time or you're quitting your job and going all in, is they think that a lot of the like best entrepreneurs are these like risk maximizers. Like they take a bunch of risks. And actually, there's a really great book, Originals, from Adam Grant, that covers a lot of this, but he shows that most successful people are not risk maximizers. They're actually risk minimizers, which means that they basically set up an environment where, yes, they will take a risk eventually, but they set up the process such that it's like very unlikely that they're going to end up on the street or like end up in this, like, again, highly pressurized situation where there's tons of examples. Like the Google founders, even though they had already started to create Google, decided, you know what, to minimize risk or mitigate risk, we're going to finish our Stanford degrees, right? Or our PhDs. There's other people like the founder of Spanx, like she continued to, she was selling printers for like many years throughout creating Spanx, because again, like she needed that mental clarity to say, I know I'm building this business, but I don't want to be like waking up every morning, like afraid that I'm not going to have an income. And so it is important to just think through, like, again, it's not binary. Like you don't have to like be working full time and then immediately go quit your job and have no income. There are in-betweens.
Exactly. I feel like it's like what is your license to create or be creative or experiment? Is the license a lack of pressure, or is it actually pressure? Because a lot of people, and you hear about this a lot, is like, well, if you want your side hustle to be a thing, add some constraints in a way that makes it so that you do have to have it pay for yourself. And then think in your mindset, like, how would I make this into something that is self-sustaining so that I could quit my job? And people use that as a motivator.
Yes.
Whereas I think what you're saying is in some ways the opposite, in terms of, well, that might not necessarily be the most healthy way of motivating you if you are a particular, if you're wired a particular way. And I guess that gets me onto like, and you don't hear about that a lot because there's some nuance required there. But
and just to clarify just one thing there, I think you're totally right that especially if you're pursuing, like if you really are building the next Uber or like tackling some of these huge problems, like, yes, there's no way you can do that with like your full-time job on the side. Like you need to raise a bunch of money, hire a bunch of people, go all in. But yes, like I think that a lot of people, it's more so that I'm not even like saying that my approach is better than another approach, but just saying that a lot of people don't even realize that like this approach can be pretty like healthy and enjoyable and just doable.
Especially if what it is that you're thinking about is being a creator or trying to build your authority or thought leadership in some way, it is about putting yourself out there, and that's inherently scary. And so I think people like to grab onto the way of doing things. So if they hear that the way that you do it is that you have to figure out a way of making it profitable immediately, like that's, well, you're getting scrappy and you're going to have to figure it out, and you're going to, you're going to soar or die, or whatever the kind of phrase is.
Yeah, it's a more binary outcome, right?
Exactly.
When we talk about like binary,
it's not actually like that. Yeah.
Exactly, right. When you go, if you quit your job, it's a pretty binary outcome where, yes, maybe there's more pressure for you to succeed, but it's like you're either going to succeed in a short period of time or you're going to fail in a short period of time. And I see people all the time, like you mentioned creators who are like, quit my job and I did it for 6 months and I just like didn't see any traction. So I had to go back to work. Now, another option is to spend like 2 years at a job working towards this, such that when you do quit, because again, you can go pursue your passion at some point, and I personally will at some point and go all in on it. But I've now had years where I've been paid, I've been, relatively relaxed in my pursuit. Mm-hmm. And when I do quit, I will be very confident that I will succeed versus someone who's quitting and who's like, again, like this is like make or break, do or die when I actually pursue this.
Proactive rather than a reactive to the situation. So just thinking about that motivation, like we've talked about that a little bit, but like what motivates you? Because I do see, and I think we framed this conversation, at least in the title, as talking about content. And certainly I think one of the things that you're known for is not just like the thoughtfulness and the intentionality of the content or the sheer stuff, the projects that you create, but also the quantity and the volume. And I know that I don't mean to try and shower you with compliments or anything, but it's actually that's something that is, on the surface of it, seems like a very difficult thing to master. And I guess my question is, how do you approach your projects from a motivational standpoint? Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of answers I could give that maybe would make this look like, a more attractive answer, but the real answer is one that I already just spent a lot of time online. So that allows me to like create content more easily than someone who's not already like surfacing and engaging with this stuff. Like think about trends. I'm just constantly interacting with new things. And I will say that I spend, again, just like a lot of time online. But the other part of that answer is kind of related to what we talked about before, where I'm telling you that if this was my full-time job, like for me to create content and this was my livelihood, I would not create, as good or as frequent content because I wouldn't want to. I would find it exhausting. I only create content today when I want to, when I see something exciting, when I'm like, I want the world to know about this. And that is inherently motivating because, again, there are days where I don't publish anything. But there are days where I publish a lot of things because I'm excited and I want to do that, right? So I know it sounds like a very simple thing, but that equation of having it just be something I want to do, only, having the pressure of like, do I want to do this or do I not, versus is this at the end of the day going to be my paycheck, makes a huge difference. And that's why I think I can actually spend more time doing this because, again, everything that I create on the side, because I don't require the money, is things that I just want to do, that I choose to do.
And I think that comes through with the purity of purpose of each of these initiatives, these projects. How do you manage it all? And I don't mean to say, oh, how do you do it? But like, just fundamentally, is it a case of like, do you have a particular style of organization or ways of structuring your weeks that you ascribe to, that you developed over the years, or is it something else?
So I will start by saying I'm actually not a very organized person. And I know that about myself. So I think the first, I don't know, like I'd say advice, but the thing that's worked for me is that the thing, not just with like projects, but working in general, that's important, is realizing how you work best. It's so silly, again, that we think about arbitrary things in life, like the 40-hour work week or going to an office at a very particular part of the day. Ever since I started working remotely 5 years ago, that's been something that's helped me so much, is just the ability to realize how I work best. And just like simple things like, where in the house do you work best? Do you work best outside the house? I tend to work best in like cafes or co-working spaces. What times of the day do you work best in like 4 hour chunks or 1 hour chunks? Do you work best in the morning or at night? Like, these are all really important things because we don't all work the same way. And I'm so much more productive once I kind of have found the like workflows that work for me. And obviously those won't work for other people. The other thing or a couple things that have been important for me are, one, I tied to this idea that like I have a certain way of working. I realized that like one of my pitfalls is that if I let a project go on forever, like it will never complete. So I time box the hell out of things. Like even my book that I wrote recently, it took me 50 days and people are like, well, you wrote that in 50 days. And I'm like, I needed to write it in 50 days. Cause if I let it go to 51, like it would have never been published. I have so many like lurking projects that I started and never finished. And I'm sure a lot of people do too. So it's like, again, understanding like, what are your constraints? Like what do you require in order to create things effectively? And then another part that I am personally working on that I'm not quite good at, but I think a lot of people struggle with, is this idea of just like focusing on too many things. So lately I've tried to focus on less things and say no to more things. I think that's like a universal issue of not being able to say no to things and focusing on too many things. And what I did a couple years ago that really helped me is to figure out like every single year, what's one thing that, similar to how people will be like, what's one thing if you accomplish it today, you'll be happy with, like you'll be happy with your day. Sure. I do the same thing every year where I'm like, what's one thing? And that started in 2018, I believe, when I learned to code. And that is actually something that whatever that thing is, coupled with a couple others, I track every single day. I don't do it like meticulously. If I miss a couple days, I'll just go back to the spreadsheet and like remember if I had done it. But for example, in 2018, learning to code, I had this just super simple spreadsheet that said, every day, are you learning to code? And it was just like an X or an O, right? Of like, if I had learned or not. And it was really helpful for accountability because often like we think we're more productive than we are, or we think we're focusing on things when we're not. So even that year, I remember I'd be like, oh yeah, I like took, because I was taking a coding course. I was like, oh yeah, I totally did that the other day. And I'd look and it'd be like 3 weeks since I had actually done the course. And so I think identifying exactly like the few things that you want to do and keeping yourself accountable, because who else is going to, is something that's helped me, actually stick to some of the things that were important for me.
And with that, so when you say, because hold yourself accountable because no one else will, let's say the book, for example, did you set out to write it and feel like you needed to get to a certain point of comfort, familiarity, confidence in the book writing process in order to do it? Or was it more like, I think I have a book in me. I think I need to do it really quickly. Let's think of this as a project like any other.
Yeah. I mean, it was more so the latter. I had seen a ton of other content out there and just on the topic of content similar to the book. And I just had this feeling where I always say, like, at best, a lot of the content like meant well, but like really wasn't accurate or maybe like had flaws. And then at worst, there was a lot of stuff that was like just wrong or misleading, or just like, someone publishing it knowing that they didn't have the requisite experience there. And I was like, I actually do think I have. I didn't know it would be a book, really. Initially, I thought it would be more so like a short ebook, like a guide type of thing. But as I started to write it, it ended up being way longer than I expected. But it really was this idea of like, let me start with something that I know. Let me set a constraint and let me just get it out there. And I actually, you mentioned like, did it need to be like a certain like level of a book, or like, did I need to have it edited perfectly? And the answer is like, not at all, because and this is a learned behavior. At first, when I was shipping things, I really was a lot more like, let me make this perfect. But as they say, like, perfection is the enemy of progress, where now I have learned to just like get things out there. And in the case of the book, I literally was the only person who saw it before it went live. Like, I didn't have an editor. I only kind of read through it like once or twice myself before it went live. Like, there was definitely typos. There was definitely like imperfections. But at the end of the day, one important part of content is a lot of people think that like good content is like good grammar, like lengthy articles. And that's not the case. It's a way of communicating. Like, this is content. It's a way of communicating ideas to people. And so I'm not saying like I'm proud that there was typos, but I'm more so proud of shipping a book with typos than not shipping one or without typos, or shipping one without typos that isn't actually, compiled with good information.
Yeah, the difference between between perfect and good enough is one exists.
Yeah, exactly. I like that.
When you're going through these projects, I mean, I think a lot of times, especially people who are maybe aspiring to build a source of independent income, or do some of these side projects, or work for themselves. It can be a very lonely experience, and I think some people don't like people, and they think that will motivate them, and others they feel like they needed accountability, or need just someone else who's kind of gone through that. When doing some of these projects, do you only work with yourself? Do you sometimes are there other, whether it's creators or other people that you have masterminds with? Like, what's your process like?
Yeah, so it's changed a lot. I will say one very like influential, helpful period of time was that especially when I was first starting in kind of creating things on my own, I was I was nomadic, so I was in a lot of places, but a big chunk of my time was spent in Canggu in Bali, and there's so many other creators who are doing similar things. And so I've never actually really paired up with any creators to create these projects, but I was surrounded by them. And that was like, your community, or your like, accountability, motivation. Yeah. And so I would encourage people to, because like you said, it can be really lonely. And even though I wasn't like partnering off with people, we would meet every Thursday, for example, and we called it Hackagu because it was Canggu, like a hackathon every Thursday. And we'd sit there, and sometimes like people like me would actually have to work on work, but we'd all show up, we'd introduce ourselves, because it'd all be roughly, after a while, it was the same people, but we'd introduce ourselves, say what we're working on. We'd all have lunch together. Throughout the day, we'd work. At the end of the day, people would like present whatever they had worked on if they wanted to. And yeah, it was just like a nice, motivating thing. And you felt like, part of a community. And so I would, again, figure out if you're a creator, figure out what you need. Do you need a co-founder? Because a lot of people do want that accountability. But if you don't, like me, then I do think there needs to be like some social mechanisms, because like if you're doing anything purely alone, it's going to get, as you said, pretty lonely pretty quickly. So I don't know if I have great advice there, other than just, similar to like figuring out how you're most productive, figure out like what you need to continue to stay motivated.
Speaking of not knowing if you have great advice there, the shit you don't learn in school. Can you just talk a little bit about that as a concept, and again, maybe what prompted you or what motivated you to start that as a podcast?
Yeah, so it's actually only started recently. If people are interested, they can go to keeplearning.fuzzbrat.com. Just plugging it. I never plug anything, but this is just like my
plug away.
No one needs to like go to any of my other stuff. This is just something that I'm personally excited about, and just it's like my most recent project, so that's why. But yeah, it's a podcast that you graduate school. We all, or the people who have gone to university, you go there and you're excited and you think you're pursuing a certain path, and then like you graduate, and it's like this juncture where after you're like, okay, what now? And then a lot of the stuff you learn, like I happened to take chemical engineering in university, 90+% of the stuff I learned I don't use anymore. Of course, it taught like critical thinking, problem solving, etc. But there's all these things instead that as I entered the workforce, like how to negotiate for a job, or like how to like take care of your money, and how to even think about that, how to like stay in touch with friends and family that you care about. Should you stay in touch with certain friends? Like all of these like questions about life that, matter, I'd say a lot more than like knowing how to size a pump, unless your job relies on it, then they matter, and you're never taught that. And I'm sure like I've seen this tweeted so many times of people being like, what should you have learned in school? And there's just like a laundry list that people come up with of things that they've run into post-education that they're like, man, why don't they teach this? Right. And so I don't claim to be an expert in a lot of these things, but it is in these episodes, they're like 15 to 30-minute episodes. Typically we talk through one of these topics, like, and it's other stuff like, how do you deal with death? Like no one teaches you how to deal with it. And there's not a correct way, but like that is something that people have experiences with and can like help other people who are like earlier on in that journey. And so I do it with my co-host. His name is Calvin Rosser. And we just kind of riff on a particular idea. We research it a little bit if we need to. And we actually, to start, because it's so recent. We've done around 30 episodes, but it's because we did a 30-day podcast challenge. So we podcasted one episode every day for 30 days, which was really exhausting. But yeah, that's the podcast, and that's kind of the premise behind it.
Do you so first off, it sounds incredibly valuable. But what piqued my interest, it was actually at the end. You mentioned 30-day podcasting challenge. You mentioned 50 days to write the book. Do you find that the way that you work best is kind of setting yourself challenges in order to get something, either maybe it's not across the line, but like getting that routine in place? Do you find that that's helpful, or is it just kind of, it depends on what it is that you're doing?
Of course it depends to some degree, but I think you're right. So a lot of people, especially content creators who are, exactly, building open or giving advice to other content creators, will often say consistency is one of the most important things that you can have. Now, I actually diverge from that opinion, but with a caveat that early on it really matters. And the reason I say early on is because when you're first starting anything, and this was really the impetus into doing this 30-day challenge, because basically, like, I had never launched a podcast before. I wanted to, but I realized as we first got going that, hey, we don't actually, we don't know how to like do a podcast. We're not used to speaking on podcasts. We're not used to editing podcasts. We don't know what all of this entails. And so in order to almost like jumpstart that process and to go all in and build that muscle early on, I do think some of these like kind of constraints and these challenges and things that keep you consistent early on and hold you to that expectation are important. After that, though, I don't think, or to reiterate, I think that challenge or that like enforcement of consistency is more important for the creator and less important for the consumer. And again, this is where I think a lot of people would diverge with my opinion there. But the reason I say this is because if you send a newsletter, of course, this differs if someone expects the news every single morning from you. But if you're just sharing like content about a particular topic, I think it is better to send less often, less consistently, and only ship when, again, you have something really great to say, really important, really thoughtful that you've spent time on and that you truly think that people would get value from, than sending an email just because there's an expectation that you send weekly. So that's my opinion. If you can meet the weekly, consistency is better than no consistency if you're talking about the same level of quality and value, but I think that's often not the case. So to get back to your question, yes, I do see value in consistency and setting some of these like challenges, and I use them a lot myself, as you mentioned, the book as well, but only really at the beginning or to get something out the door. After that, I think once you've built the muscle to actually engage in that practice, then consistency is less important, and then it's more about like, how do I ship something valuable when I can?
I think that's really insightful, and the best creators are those that that have a high average in terms of quality of what it is they're putting out. And it's the ones that are noisy but not really impactful that seem to just like sputter.
Exactly, right?
But at the same time, as you say, you have to balance it. Like, personally, I love creating things, but I am crap at tweeting or posting things, and I don't do that normally. So a lot of the stuff that I make is like mostly just for myself because I can never get going again. And I think a lot of people kind of maybe identify with that of then trying to put on a mask or trying to say, oh, I need to be the tweeter and I need to tweet 3 times a day because that's what the algorithm wants. And I was talking with Alex Abel the other day. And he was talking about how, when you're talking about engagement, you're not talking about tweeting 3 times a day. You're talking about like, how are you making friends? How are you engage? How are you putting yourself out there? How are you getting yourself out there? It's not just an outward facing mechanism. It's a communication platform, and you need to be thinking of it that way. So yeah, all of this makes a whole bunch of sense. So one thing I know that I have quite a few areas I'd love to dig into, but in 2018, you did the year of the sponge. You wrote a blog post about that, and there was something that you said in it. You said you needed to do a few things. 1, acknowledge that you're not that great. 2, identify the gaps in your life, and 3, hold yourself accountable and track your progress. And I think that at least a lot of people that that I talk with, the acknowledgement that they're not that great, pretty easy. We all have imposter syndrome. We are none of us are good at anything. Identifying the gaps in our life, pretty easy as well. But holding yourself accountable and tracking your progress, if you're your own worst enemy and you do angle on that side of perfectionism, how do you break the cycle, or how did you maybe break the cycle of maybe saying, all right, here's my plan. I'm feeling really good. All right, I'm going to plan out my whole year. This week is great. I'm firing on all cylinders. This is going to be a fantastic year. And then I have my system in terms of holding myself accountable. I have my spreadsheet. And then a week later, you've fallen off the wagon and you feel shit about yourself. And you're like, that could have happened 10 years ago. I've just completely forgot it. It sounds to me like that third thing is the hardest entity of that. And so how did you push through that? And maybe you disagree, but yeah, I'm just curious.
No, it's definitely a component, and a very difficult component to keep yourself accountable. I have a couple different answers here. The first is that I keep repeating this with like figuring out what works for you, but one important book, now it's not scientific at all, that helped me is called The 4 Tendencies. And the reason it's helpful is because it's from the author, Gretchen Rubin. She's the type of person, you talked about like New Year's resolutions, like people set them. And I'll talk about all 4 of them briefly, but she is an upholder in the 4 tendencies. And the upholder is someone who like both can be motivated by internal accountability or external accountability, which means that when she sets her New Year's resolution, if she thinks it's important, she will complete it, which is why she actually ended up going down this rabbit hole of writing this book, is because she would write a New Year's resolution and then she would do it, and then she would see all her friends write them or determine them. And then and just like drop off a cliff. And she was like, why don't you guys just like meet your goals? Like you set your goals, and like why didn't you do it? And she basically identified this framework where it's, imagine like a 2x2 matrix, and it's all about inner and outer accountability and how you respond to it. And so again, she's an upholder, which tends to respond well to both. I am a questioner, which is someone who responds well to inner accountability, but not outer. There's also an upholder, an obliger, which is the opposite of a questioner, which is they respond well to outer accountability, but not inner. And then there's a rebel that actually is kind of averse to both. But the important side here is this actually, and again, it's not scientific, but this actually helped me understand certain things in my life where, for example, if you're I'm a questioner. If you're an obliger, someone who responds well to outer, you will probably respond better to someone like a gym buddy if you're trying to get fit than setting, your internal goals and saying, I'm going to work out every day. Right? That gym buddy provides the external motivation for you versus someone like me. I actually that won't impact me at all if I have a gym buddy. But instead, if I find a way to internalize why this is important, why this is part of my identity, for example, then it works. And that's what's helped me before, where even, at times where I've been like slogging, I've thought, and I'm like, do I really want to be the person who like can't stay fit, or like who can't, one of the things the example whenever I go over this that I always give, which people find a little crazy, is I did not really drink water until like a couple years ago. Obviously, like I had drank water, but throughout the day, like I really wouldn't drink water. And it's because until a certain point, and again, this sounds crazy to most people, I hadn't internalized why it was important. I was like, yeah, I know this is important, but like I don't feel thirsty, and like I'm drinking other stuff, and so it's probably fine. And I'm young, and then all of a sudden, like just reading about it enough myself, which again sounds crazy. I realize this whenever I tell a story, but once I had internally motivated myself to be like, are you really going to be someone that doesn't drink water? Like, are you really going to be someone who like treats your body this way? Then that internal accountability for me as a questioner mattered. So figuring out like what you are motivated by, and then setting up your life. Like, do you need the gym buddy, or do you need to set up your like internal tracking system like I do, right? That's really important. The second is just acknowledging that I wrote about this in the Year of Sponge, but when you are in school, we spend 18 plus, maybe even 20. I spent 21 years, or up until I was 21, in school. Throughout that whole period of time, you are kept accountable by the system that you're in. And it's wonderful in that way, right? It teaches you to hit deadlines. It teaches you to, continue learning.
Your way around.
Exactly. Learning new things every single year. And you just accept that. And then you graduate, and of course you have a job, but even think about within jobs, like you learn for a little period of time, and then you can kind of just coast most of the time. And you're also within a job, you can stay in a particular career or route for decades and not really learn anything substantially new. And so even though we're taught to learn for a long period of time, for 2 decades, after that, it just drops off the cliff and there's no accountability for you outside of what you set, right? Yeah. And a lot of people don't set any sort of like milestones every single year. Of course, some people set a goal, but typically it's almost like goals to keep them at their baseline and not like to advance in some way. And so if you do want to keep advancing, then you do need to set clear goals and hold yourself accountable in the ways that make sense for you, leading back to the 4 tendencies. And for me, what that meant, especially in that year, I mentioned this before, it was a spreadsheet tracking. The most important thing to me that year was learning to code. That was like, I saw that as, if I don't do this, like I'm never going to do it. And if I can't do this, like, why not? Right. And so then I set this spreadsheet. I tracked it every single day for 365 days. I still like have that data. And that's what motivated me in the end. So you're right that final part of like actually going and doing the thing and making sure that you do it is hard, but figuring out what motivates you. And if you are someone that is driven by goals and milestones and tracking like I am, then one important thing to just acknowledge here is that similar to what I mentioned about like you have a school phase and then you have a not school phase, which is like a learning phase, and then typically not a learning phase, is just this idea that when you're setting goals in your life, the importance of that is to balance the goals that you typically are going to have set in work, right? So most people in their jobs, they have KPIs, right? And they kind of dictate your time. And this is especially important now that people are remote. We all know that the boundaries kind of disappear, they fade away, and your day is kind of just blended together. If you don't have goals, like clear goals, and not just goals like 3 bullet points, but like actual metrics that you're tracking to in your daily life outside of work, then you're always going to invest any extra energy you have into your work, like as in your job, because that can actually be tracked, right? It's not even a conscious thing, but if you have an extra hour, you're going to be like, oh, well, I could actually like get that extra lead so I can hit my exactly. Like bonus metric.
Yeah.
But if you add those kind of balancing metrics, it sounds a little counterintuitive because you're like adding more goals into your life and it can sound overwhelming, but it actually is. I find it to be a really balancing mechanism where now I have these goals, these really clear goals that I'm setting in my personal life, which now I hold to an equal standard. And so that's something that's really helped me balance the two.
Absolutely. I think that's fantastic. So I know that we're running out of time. I did want to touch on one thing, just as a quick example of something that you're doing, which is the Amplify scholarship series, especially the idea that. So first off, I'd love you to share what it is, but also why did you build it the way that you did, and in a collaborative way, rather than, let's say, this is my brainchild, this is what I'm doing, and here it is.
Yeah. So if people are interested, they can go to stephsmith.io/amplify. It is a scholarship series. It's 12 scholarships in 12 months. I start and I seed the scholarships $500 each. And then people, as you said, can contribute to it openly. And, similar to other parts of my creation process have been fully in the open. People can find other stuff like how often I exercise or some of those like tracking mechanisms that I just mentioned at stephsmith.io/open. But the idea was I had seen so many people, do the 12 startups in 12 months, for example. Yeah. That got a lot of attention because it's like, oh, you're doing something new and exciting every month. And I said, I don't really want to do 12 startups in 12 months. I think it's overdone. And I don't have the time for it, frankly. But what I thought was interesting is like, why can't I use this mechanism that I know works to, build on something that I think is a little more beneficial for other people, which is these scholarships. And just as a side note, like I got through university because I was on scholarships. Like I wouldn't have been able to afford it. And like I know a lot of people like hate on universities and like higher education these days, but I see the value in them. Do I like the price ranges? No, but the point is I've seen the value and I wanted to be able to kind of allow people to do the same thing. And so I created this 12 scholarships in 12 months framework. And as I mentioned, people can contribute to it as well. And if they contribute to it, they can be involved in like the decision process. They can also come to me if they have like a scholarship in mind. They're like, I want to see this one. Like we do it together and we choose the topic together. But the main idea behind this whole thing was this idea actually from Calvin, from the same person from my podcast. He started doing scholarships before I did. And he really helped me with this concept of giving as a skill, which is basically that like a lot of people wait till some point in their life when they can give. And it's like, what is that when you have $100,000?
Yeah.
When you have $1 million, $1 billion, like what point are you going to have enough to give? And the idea is that giving, just like any other skill, like writing or coding or whatever, is a skill that you have to like build the muscle for. And so you don't need to give away half of your net worth today. But if you start with these small practices of starting to give, then you build up that muscle such that throughout your whole life you give, and there's no like day where you start giving. It's just something that you've kind of built in, and eventually becomes a little more. Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it's just something that you do, and it's also like what you said there is important, because a lot of people decide one day like, today I'm a philanthropist and today I'm giving back 50% of my wealth. But I think what's actually much better is just throughout your life, you just continue to give away part of your wealth, and then there's no day that you become a philanthropist. It's just something that you do.
I particularly love, though, the fact that, so obviously we, Hey Summit is about summits, right? So but the whole point of running a virtual summit is harnessing the network that you have, right, to provide value. And I think that the thing that I love about how you've articulated, but also how you've approached Amplify, is $500 is a lot, but it's also not a lot. But the impact is inherently tied to the scalability of this. And so your task, it seemed like, taking on this you're using phrases like it's framework. It's something that requires, if it's successful, that means other people engage with it, and you're harnessing the network that you have, or the audience that you have, in order to make that kind of thing happen. I think that transcends the, here's my little creation, what do you think of it, versus like, hey guys, we can actually do something. Let me provide my guidance about how to do that, and let's impact things together. So I think that that's a really elegant thing that you've brought into the world. But from the standpoint of a creator, the way that you've harnessed different elements has been, it's just really interesting.
Thanks. And just one note on that, a lot of people, they're hearing me say like giving is a skill or like a muscle
Sure.
to build. It doesn't necessarily need to be with money, right? So I am, creating something monetary here with scholarships, but like one part of that, as you mentioned, is like, if people haven't done this before, giving a scholarship without certain platforms is like really hard to do, because even if you have the money, it's like, how do you get applicants, and how do you actually like go through the vetting process, and how do you award it, and how do you like actually give the students the money. And the nice part about this is that I had several people reach out to me after they saw I launched this project, who were like, oh, I've always wanted to give back, but like I never really knew how, right? And of course they knew how to give back to like a charity, but they're like, had I wanted to do a scholarship, I wouldn't have known how. And so this is like a way to not just like monetarily give back, but you can give back with your time, right? You can give back with your organization or your connections, right? It doesn't have to be money in the way that you're actually giving back, but you can build up the skill to like naturally just think like, what do I have accessible to me? Like you said, community that I can utilize for something that maybe is a little bigger than myself.
Absolutely. I just think I think it's really elegant, and I'm excited to see what happens with it. So thanks so much again for joining
Sure.
me. And thanks for going a little bit over with me. If anybody out there wants to hear more about her many projects in coding, in productivity, in growth marketing, please connect with her on Twitter. She's at Steph Smith IO, or visit her website and blog, which is at blog.stephsmith.io. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You too.
Alrighty.
Bye.
See ya.